The city has a way of chewing you up and spitting you out, but I've always loved it for that. There's something about the chaos, the way the streets hum with life at all hours, the way the neon signs flicker like they're alive, the way the air smells like a mix of exhaust and possibility. That makes me feel like I belong here. I'm a musician, or at least I'm trying to be. The indie scene here is brutal, but it's also where I've found my tribe. We're all a little broken, a little desperate, but there's a raw honesty in what we do that you can't find anywhere else. My band, if you can even call it that, is just me and a couple of guys I met at an open mic night. We're not exactly setting the world on fire, but we're grinding, playing every dive bar and basement show that will have us. It's not glamorous, but it's real, and for now, that's enough. I remember the first time I saw her. It was at this tiny venue called the Rusty Note, a place that's seen better days but still has a certain charm if you squint hard enough. She was standing near the stage, surrounded by people who hung on her every word like she was some kind of goddess. Sophia. Even her name sounded like it belonged to someone who was destined for greatness. She was everything I wasn't: polished, confident, effortlessly cool. Her band, the Velvet Echoes, was the talk of the city, and for good reason. They had this sound that was impossible to ignore, a mix of haunting melodies and lyrics that cut straight to the bone. I hated how much I admired them, but I couldn't help it. They were good. She was good. Our first encounter wasn't exactly a meet-cute. I was packing up my gear after a particularly rough set when she walked over. I thought maybe she was going to compliment me or at least say something nice, but instead, she looked me up and down like I was something she'd scraped off her shoe. "You've got potential," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "But you're trying too hard. It comes off as amateurish." I stood there stunned as she turned on her heel and walked away, leaving me to stew in my own inadequacy. Her words stung, but they also lit a fire in me. I wasn't just going to take that lying down. If she thought I was amateurish, I'd show her exactly what I was capable of. From that day on, I threw myself into my music with a vengeance. I practiced until my fingers bled, wrote songs that poured out of me like blood from a wound, and played every gig I could get my hands on. I wasn't just doing it for myself anymore. I was doing it to prove her wrong. I wanted to see the look on her face when I finally made it, when I was the one headlining shows and she was the one watching from the crowd. It wasn't just about the music anymore. It was about pride. I started networking like crazy, schmoozing with promoters, and handing out demos to anyone who would take them. I even started showing up at her shows, not because I wanted to see her, but because I wanted to learn. I studied her every move, from the way she commanded the stage to the way she interacted with the crowd. She was good, but I was determined to be better. For a while, it felt like I was making progress. We started getting better gigs, and people were actually starting to recognize us. It wasn't much, but it was something. I could feel the momentum building, like we were on the cusp of something big. And then, just as I was starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, I could make it in this cutthroat industry, I heard the news. Sophia and the Velvet Echoes had been tapped to headline the biggest music festival in the city. It was the kind of opportunity most musicians only dream of, and she'd gotten it without even breaking a sweat. Meanwhile, I was still playing to half-empty rooms and begging for scraps. It felt like a slap in the face, a reminder that no matter how hard I worked, I'd always be second best. But I wasn't going to let that stop me. If anything, it just made me more determined. I didn't know how yet, but I was going to find a way to make my mark, to prove that I belonged on that stage just as much as she did. And maybe, just maybe, I'd get the chance to show her exactly what I was made of. The rejection email came on a Tuesday morning, and I remember staring at my phone screen like it had personally betrayed me. "We regret to inform you," it began, and I didn't even need to read the rest. I already knew what it was going to say. The festival, the one I'd been dreaming about for years, the one that could have been my big break, had decided I wasn't good enough. It felt like a punch to the gut, and for a moment I just sat there, numb, trying to process what had just happened. I'd poured everything into my application. My best recordings, a heartfelt letter about what music meant to me, even a video of one of our live performances. And for what? To be told, in the politest possible terms, that I wasn't worth their time. I couldn't help but think about Sophia, how she'd probably been invited to headline without even having to ask. Of course she had. She was the golden girl, the one who had everything handed to her on a silver platter. Beautiful, privileged, connected. She was everything the industry loved, and I was just another nobody trying to claw my way up from the bottom. It wasn't fair, but then again, when had life ever been fair? I spent the rest of the day wallowing in self-pity, ranting to anyone who would listen about how the system was rigged against people like me. My bandmates tried to cheer me up, but even they couldn't deny how much this hurt. We'd been so close, or at least it had felt that way. Now it was like the door had been slammed in our faces and we were back to square one. I didn't know what to do next. Keep grinding, I guess. But the thought of starting over again was exhausting. I was tired of fighting for every scrap of recognition, tired of feeling like I was always one step behind, tired of wondering if I'd ever catch a break. Maybe it was time to face the facts. I wasn't cut out for this. Maybe I should just pack it in and get a real job like everyone kept telling me to do. The thought made me sick to my stomach, but what other choice did I have? And then, just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, my phone rang. I almost didn't answer it. I wasn't in the mood to talk to anyone, but something made me pick up. It was the festival organizer, the same one who'd sent the rejection email. My heart started racing as she explained the situation. Sophia's band, the Velvet Echoes, had dropped out. There'd been some kind of internal drama, creative differences, egos clashing, the usual stuff, and they had decided to pull out at the last minute. The festival was in a bind, and they needed a replacement fast. Would I be interested? I didn't know what to say. On one hand, this was everything I'd been working for. It was my big break, the chance to prove myself on a stage I'd only ever dreamed of playing. On the other hand, it meant sharing that stage with Sophia, the same person who dismissed me as amateurish and made me feel like I didn't belong. I was torn between excitement and dread, but in the end, there was only one answer. I said yes. The first rehearsal was a disaster. I showed up early, my nerves already on edge, and found Sophia waiting for me in the studio. She looked as flawless as ever, but there was something off about her. A tension in her shoulders, a tightness around her eyes that hadn't been there before. She greeted me with a curt nod, her tone cold and professional, and we got straight to work. Or at least, we tried to. The chemistry that had been so electric when we were rivals was nowhere to be found. Every suggestion I made was met with a dismissive shrug, and every idea she had felt like a veiled insult. It was like we were speaking two different languages and neither of us was willing to translate. Still, I couldn't help but notice the cracks in her armor. The way her voice wavered when she talked about the band's breakup. The way she avoided eye contact when she thought I wasn't looking. She was hurting, and as much as I wanted to hate her, I couldn't. Not completely. Things came to a head during a particularly tense moment in the rehearsal. We were trying to figure out the set list, and I suggested opening with one of my songs, a high-energy track that I thought would get the crowd pumped. Sophia shot it down immediately, saying it was too derivative and lacked depth. I snapped. All the frustration and resentment I'd been bottling up came pouring out, and before I knew it, we were in the middle of a full-blown argument. "You think you're so much better than me, don't you?" I shouted, my voice echoing off the walls of the studio. "You think just because you've had a few lucky breaks, you can look down on the rest of us. Well, newsflash, Sophia, you're not perfect. And if you weren't so busy trying to prove how great you are, maybe you'd actually listen to someone else for once." She stared at me, her eyes wide with shock, and for a moment, I thought she might actually apologize. But then her expression hardened, and she fired back with a venomous retort that cut deeper than I cared to admit. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my guitar and stormed out, slamming the door behind me. As I walked away, my mind was racing. Was this really worth it? Was this opportunity, this chance to prove myself, worth putting up with her arrogance and condescension? I didn't know. All I knew was that I couldn't go back in there, not yet. I needed time to think, to figure out what I really wanted. But as I stood there on the sidewalk, the city buzzing around me, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. I was sitting on the floor of my apartment, strumming aimlessly on my guitar, when the knock came. It was late, way too late for visitors, and I wasn't expecting anyone. My first thought was that it was one of my bandmates, probably here to check on me after my dramatic exit from rehearsal. But when I opened the door, it wasn't one of the guys standing there. It was Sophia. For a moment, we just stared at each other, the tension between us so thick you could cut it with a knife. She looked different somehow, smaller, like the weight of the world was pressing down on her shoulders. Her usual air of confidence was gone, replaced by something I couldn't quite put my finger on. Vulnerability, maybe? I didn't know what to say, so I just stood there, waiting for her to make the first move. "Can I come in?" she asked finally, her voice soft and hesitant. I hesitated too, unsure if I was ready to face her after everything that had happened. But there was something in her eyes, a rawness, a sincerity, that made me step aside and let her in. She walked past me into the apartment, her gaze sweeping over the cluttered space like she was trying to take it all in. I suddenly felt self-conscious about the mess, the mismatched furniture, the posters peeling off the walls. This wasn't the kind of place someone like Sophia would normally set foot in, and yet here she was, standing in the middle of my living room like she belonged there. "I'm sorry," she said, the words catching me off guard. I hadn't expected an apology, not from her. She turned to face me, her arms crossed over her chest like she was trying to hold herself together. "I was out of line earlier. I shouldn't have said those things to you." I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to lash out, to remind her of all the times she'd made me feel small, but the other part of me, the part that had seen the cracks in her armor, just wanted to understand. So I nodded, gesturing for her to sit down. She hesitated for a moment before sinking onto the couch, her posture stiff and awkward. I sat down across from her, my guitar still in my hands, and waited for her to continue. What followed was a conversation I never would have imagined having with her. She opened up in a way I didn't think she was capable of, talking about the pressure she'd been under, the toll it had taken on her mental health, the way her relationships had suffered because of her career. She told me about the band's breakup, how it had left her feeling lost and alone, like she didn't know who she was without them. "I thought I had it all figured out," she admitted, her voice trembling. "But the truth is, I've been faking it this whole time, and now, I don't know what I'm doing anymore." I didn't know what to say. I'd always seen her as this untouchable figure, someone who had everything I wanted. But now I realized that wasn't the whole story. She was just as human as I was, just as flawed, just as scared. And for the first time, I felt like I really saw her. I told her about my own struggles, the years of rejection and self-doubt, the constant feeling that I wasn't good enough. I talked about how her words had stung, but also how they'd pushed me to be better. "I've spent so much time trying to prove you wrong," I admitted. "But maybe I've been going about it the wrong way. Maybe we're not so different after all." She smiled at that, a small, tentative smile that made her look younger, softer. And just like that, the dynamic between us shifted. We weren't rivals anymore. We were allies, two people who'd been through the ringer and come out the other side. We talked for hours about music, about life, about the things that mattered to us. And as the night wore on, I realized that I didn't just respect her. I liked her. And that by the time we got around to discussing the festival performance, the tension between us had melted away. We decided to rewrite the setlist together, blending our styles into something fresh and unexpected. It wasn't easy. We still had our differences, but there was a chemistry between us that made it work. We bounced ideas off each other, feeding off each other's energy. And before long, we had something that felt special. It was raw and honest, a reflection of everything we'd been through, and I couldn't wait to share it with the world. As we worked, the hours slipped by unnoticed. The apartment was quiet except for the sound of our voices and the occasional strum of my guitar. At some point, Sophia leaned back against the couch, her eyes half closed, and let out a contented sigh. "This is nice," she said softly, and I knew exactly what she meant. It was nice, not just the music, but the connection we'd found. There was a warmth between us, a closeness that went beyond words. And then, in a moment that felt both inevitable and terrifying, our eyes met. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to stop, and I could have sworn I saw something in her gaze, something that mirrored the feelings I'd been trying to ignore. But before either of us could act on it, she looked away, breaking the spell. "We should probably call it a night," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, my heart still racing, and watched as she gathered her things and headed for the door. After she left, I sat there for a long time, replaying the night in my mind. I didn't know what was going to happen next, but one thing was clear. Things between us had changed. And whether that was a good thing or a bad thing, I couldn't say. All I knew was that I couldn't wait to find out. The day of the festival was a whirlwind of chaos and excitement, the kind of day that makes you feel alive in a way nothing else can. The city was buzzing with energy, the streets packed with people heading toward the festival grounds, their faces painted with anticipation. Backstage, it was even crazier. Artists and crew members rushing around, the air thick with the smell of sweat and adrenaline. I remember standing there, my guitar slung over my shoulder, trying to take it all in. This was it, the moment I'd been working toward for years. And yet, as I looked out at the massive crowd, I couldn't shake the nerves that had been gnawing at me all day. What if I messed up? What if I wasn't good enough? What if this was all just a fluke? I felt a hand on my shoulder and turned to see Sophia standing beside me, her expression calm, but her eyes betraying the same anxiety I was feeling. "We've got this," she said, her voice steady despite the tension in the air. I nodded, grateful for her presence, and together we walked out onto the stage. The performance was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. The crowd was massive, a sea of faces stretching out as far as the eye could see, and the energy was electric. From the moment we started playing, it was like the world fell away, leaving just the music and the connection between us. We'd spent weeks perfecting the set list, blending our styles into something that felt fresh and authentic, and it showed. The audience was hooked from the first note, their cheers and applause fueling us as we poured everything we had into the performance. I remember looking over at Sophia at one point, her face lit up by the stage lights, and feeling a surge of pride. We were doing this, together, and it was working. The chemistry between us was undeniable, both musically and personally, and when our eyes met on stage, it felt like a moment of pure connection, like we were the only two people in the world. It was exhilarating, terrifying, and utterly unforgettable. By the time we finished the last song, the crowd was on their feet, their applause ringing in my ears like a symphony. I felt a rush of adrenaline unlike anything I'd ever experienced, a heady mix of relief and triumph. We'd done it. We'd blown them away. And for the first time, I felt like I truly belonged in this world, like all the years of struggle and self-doubt had been worth it. Sophia turned to me, her face glowing with the same exhilaration I was feeling, and without thinking, I pulled her into a hug. For a moment, we just stood there, holding on to each other as the crowd's cheers washed over us. It was a perfect moment, one I knew I'd remember for the rest of my life. Backstage, the energy was just as electric. Everyone was buzzing with excitement, congratulating us on the performance and talking about how it was one of the best sets of the night. Sophia and I were both riding high, the adrenaline still coursing through our veins, and it felt like the perfect moment to take things to the next level. We'd been dancing around this thing between us for weeks, and now, with the success of the performance still fresh in our minds, it felt like the walls were finally coming down. I caught her eye across the room, and for a moment it was like the rest of the world disappeared. She smiled at me, a soft, private smile that made my heart race, and I started to make my way over to her. But before I could reach her, her manager appeared out of nowhere, his expression serious and his voice cutting through the noise like a knife. "Sophia, we need to talk," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. She hesitated, glancing at me with an apologetic look, before following him into a corner of the room. I tried to give them space, but I couldn't help overhearing snippets of their conversation. This is a huge opportunity, her manager was saying, his voice low but urgent. They're offering you everything, creative control, a massive budget, the works, but they want you to focus on your solo career, no distractions. My stomach dropped as the word sank in. A solo deal, with a major label. It was the kind of opportunity most artists only dreamed of, and it was being handed to her on a silver platter. But at what cost? I watched as Sophia's expression shifted from excitement to uncertainty, her eyes flicking toward me before she quickly looked away. I need to think about it, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Her manager nodded, but I could tell he wasn't happy about it. Don't take too long, he warned before walking away, leaving Sophia standing there, her face a mask of conflicting emotions. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to go to her, to tell her how much this meant to me, how much we meant to me. But another part of me was scared. Scared of what this could mean for us, for the connection we'd worked so hard to build. I stood there, frozen, as the reality of the situation settled over me like a heavy blanket. This wasn't just about music anymore. It was about choices, about sacrifices, about the paths we were willing to take. And as much as I wanted to believe that we could find a way to make it work, I couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change. The days after the festival were a blur of emotions, a roller coaster of highs and lows that left me feeling more drained than I'd ever been. Sophia's decision loomed over everything, an unspoken tension that neither of us knew how to address. She was torn. I could see it in the way she hesitated whenever the subject came up, in the way her eyes would dart to me and then quickly away, like she was afraid of what she might find. The offer from the major label was everything she'd ever wanted, a chance to take her career to the next level, but it came with strings attached. They wanted her to focus on her solo career, to cut ties with anything or anyone that might distract her. And that included me. I tried to be supportive, to tell her that I understood, that she should do what was best for her. But deep down, it hurt. It felt like I was being left behind all over again, like no matter how hard I worked, I'd always be second best. For a while, we tried to pretend that nothing had changed. We kept working together, rehearsing for smaller gigs and collaborating on new material. But the dynamic between us was different. There was a distance there that hadn't been there before, a wall that neither of us knew how to break down. Sophia was distracted, her mind constantly elsewhere, and I could feel her pulling away. It wasn't just the music, it was everything. The late-night conversations, the shared laughter, the moments of quiet understanding that had started to feel like the most natural thing in the world. They were slipping through my fingers, and I didn't know how to stop it. As Sophia got swept up in the whirlwind of her solo career, I threw myself into my music, trying to fill the void she'd left behind. I played more gigs, wrote more songs, poured everything I had into my craft. But it wasn't the same without her. The music felt emptier, like it was missing a piece of itself, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was just going through the motions. The passion that had once driven me, the fire that had kept me going through all the rejections and setbacks was flickering out. And without it, I felt lost. The low point came on a rainy Tuesday night, after yet another gig that had left me feeling more defeated than inspired. The crowd had been sparse, the energy non-existent, and by the time I got home, I was soaked to the bone and utterly drained. I sat on the floor of my apartment, my guitar resting uselessly in my lap, and stared at the walls. The same walls that had once felt like a sanctuary now felt like a prison, closing in on me with every passing second. I thought about Sophia, about the way she'd looked at me during the festival, about the connection we'd shared. And then, I thought about the distance that had grown between us, the way she'd slowly but surely pulled away. It felt like a metaphor for my entire life, always reaching for something just out of grasp, always falling short. I started to wonder if I'd ever achieve my dreams, if I'd ever be more than just a footnote in someone else's story. Maybe I wasn't cut out for this. Maybe I'd been fooling myself all along, chasing a dream that was never meant to be mine. The thought was like a knife to the heart, but once it took root, I couldn't shake it. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, staring into the abyss, and I didn't know if I had the strength to step back. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, my phone rang. I almost didn't answer it. I wasn't in the mood to talk to anyone, but something made me pick up. It was Sophia. Her voice was soft, hesitant, and there was something in her tone that made my heart skip a beat. "Hey," she said, and even that one word was enough to send a jolt of electricity through me. "Can we meet? There's something I need to talk to you about." I didn't know what to say. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what this could mean, but all I could manage was a quiet, "Yeah, of course." She gave me the name of a cafe and hung up, leaving me sitting there in the silence, my thoughts spinning in 1,000 different directions. I didn't know what to expect. Part of me was scared. Scared that she was going to tell me she'd made her decision, that she was leaving for good. But another part of me, a small, stubborn part, held on to the hope that maybe, just maybe, this was something else. Maybe she'd realized that what we had was worth fighting for. Maybe she'd decided to take a chance on us, on the connection we'd built, on the music we'd created together. Or maybe I was just fooling myself, clinging to a dream that was already slipping away. As I got ready to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that this meeting was going to change everything. Whether it was for better or worse, I didn't know. All I knew was that I couldn't keep living in this limbo, this endless cycle of hope and heartbreak. Whatever happened next, I needed to face it head on. And so, with a deep breath and a heart full of uncertainty, I walked out the door, ready to meet whatever was waiting for me on the other side. The bar was the same as I remembered it. Dim, smoky, and filled with the kind of people who came here to forget their problems or find new ones. It was our spot, mine and Sophia's, though it had been weeks since we'd last been here together. The air smelled like stale beer and fried food, and the jukebox in the corner played a song I didn't recognize, but felt like it had been written just for this moment. Sophia was already there, sitting at our usual table in the back, her hands wrapped around a glass of something amber and half-finished. She looked different, smaller somehow, like the weight of the world had pressed her into the chair. Her hair was pulled into a loose ponytail, and she wore no makeup, which was unusual for her. She looked tired, but more than that, she looked real. For the first time in a long time, she didn't seem like the untouchable queen of the music scene. She just looked like Sophia. I slid into the seat across from her, the vinyl squeaking under my weight. She looked up, her eyes meeting mine, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence between us was heavy, loaded with all the things we hadn't said, all the distance that had grown between us. Finally, she broke it. "Thanks for coming," she said, her voice quiet but steady. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. She took a sip of her drink, her hands trembling slightly, and then set the glass down with a soft clink. "I've been thinking a lot lately," she began, her eyes fixed on the table. "About the festival, about the music, about us." The word hung in the air between us, fragile and full of meaning. I waited, my heart pounding in my chest, as she took a deep breath and continued. "This solo career, it's not what I thought it would be. It's lonely. And it's not real, not like what we had. I miss that. I miss you." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. I'd spent so much time feeling like I was the one who wasn't good enough, like I was always chasing after her. But now I realized that she'd been chasing something too. And in the process, we'd both lost sight of what really mattered. "Sophia," I started, my voice rough with emotion, but she held up a hand to stop me. "Let me say this," she said, her eyes meeting mine again. "I've always been intimidated by you. Your talent, your passion, it's like you have this fire inside you that I could never match. And instead of embracing that, I tried to compete with it. I thought I had to be better than you to succeed. But now I realize that's not what it's about. We're better together. I'm better with you." Her voice broke on the last word, and she looked away, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. I reached across the table, my hand covering hers, and she didn't pull away. We talked for hours about everything and nothing, about the pressure she'd been under, the toll it had taken on her mental health, the way she'd felt like she was losing herself, about my own struggles, the years of rejection and self-doubt, the constant feeling that I wasn't good enough. And as the night wore on, I realized that I didn't just respect her. I cared about her, more than I'd ever admitted to myself. By the time we left the bar, it felt like a weight had been lifted. We decided to start collaborating again, but this time it was different. There was no rivalry, no competition, just a shared vision for the future and a mutual respect that had been missing before. We spent the next few weeks working on new music, pouring everything we had into the songs. It was raw and honest, a reflection of everything we'd been through. And I could feel the chemistry between us growing stronger with every note. There were moments when it felt like we were in sync, like we were two halves of the same whole, and it was impossible to ignore the spark that had always been there between us. One night, as we were working late in the studio, something shifted. We'd been going over a new song, our voices blending together in a way that felt almost magical. And when we finished, there was a moment of silence that stretched between us. I looked over at her, and she was already looking at me, her eyes soft and full of something I couldn't quite name. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to stop, and I could have sworn I saw something in her gaze, something that mirrored the feelings I'd been trying to ignore. But before either of us could act on it, she looked away, breaking the spell. "We should probably call it a night," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, my heart still racing, and watched as she gathered her things and headed for the door. But one thing was clear. Things between us had changed, and whether that was a good thing or a bad thing, I couldn't say. All I knew was that I couldn't wait to find out. The first kiss happened on a night that felt like any other, except it wasn't. We'd been working late in the studio, as usual, the air thick with the hum of creativity and the faint smell of coffee gone cold. The song we were working on was different from anything we'd done before, raw, unfiltered, and deeply personal. It was about second chances, about finding light in the darkness, and as we sang the final chorus together, our voices blending in a way that felt almost otherworldly, something shifted. The music faded, and for a moment, there was only silence. I looked over at her, and she was already looking at me, her eyes soft and full of something I couldn't quite name. The tension between us had been building for weeks, a slow burn that neither of us had acknowledged. But now it was impossible to ignore. I don't know who moved first, but suddenly we were standing close. So close I could feel the warmth of her breath on my skin. And then, without a word, she kissed me. It wasn't a grand, dramatic gesture, just a quiet, intimate moment that felt inevitable, like the final note of a song you've been waiting to hear your whole life. When we pulled away, neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. Everything we'd been trying to say was right there in the space between us. After that, things changed. It wasn't just about the music anymore. It was about us. We tried to keep things professional, to focus on the work, but it was impossible. The chemistry between us was too strong, too undeniable. Every glance, every touch, every shared laugh felt charged with electricity, like we were living in a world that was brighter, sharper, more alive than the one we'd known before. But it wasn't easy. Balancing our growing feelings with the demands of our careers was messy and complicated. And there were times when it felt like we were walking a tightrope, one wrong step away from falling. Sophia's solo career was still a factor, and though she'd turned down the major label deal, the pressure to succeed was always there, lurking in the background like a shadow. And then there was the music. We were creating something special, something that felt bigger than either of us, but it came at a cost. The songs we wrote were raw and honest, a reflection of everything we'd been through, and that kind of vulnerability wasn't easy. There were nights when we argued, when the weight of it all felt like too much, but even then, there was a connection between us that couldn't be broken. We were in this together, for better or worse, and that was enough. The music we created during that time was unlike anything we'd done before. It was raw, honest, and deeply personal. a reflection of the journey we'd been on and the connection we'd found. The songs resonated with people in a way neither of us could have achieved alone, and it wasn't long before we started gaining attention. Our first single, a haunting ballad about love and redemption, went viral, and suddenly we were everywhere. On the radio, in magazines, on social media. It was surreal, but it was also validating. For the first time, it felt like we were being seen for who we really were, not just as individuals, but as a team. And that was the thing. We were a team, in every sense of the word. The music was better because we were together, and so were we. But just as things were starting to fall into place, life threw us another curveball. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon while we were in the middle of rehearsing for an upcoming show. Sophia's phone buzzed, and she stepped away to take the call. I didn't think much of it at first. She got calls all the time, but when she came back, her face was pale, her expression unreadable. "What's wrong?" I asked, my stomach twisting with unease. She hesitated, her eyes searching mine like she was trying to find the right words. "I just got an offer," she said finally, her voice quiet. "An international tour, 6 months, all over the world. It's a huge opportunity." Her words hung in the air between us, heavy with meaning. I didn't know what to say. On one hand, I was happy for her. This was everything she'd ever wanted, everything we'd both worked so hard for. But on the other hand, it felt like a punch to the gut. 6 months. That was a long time to be apart, and I couldn't help but wonder what it would mean for us, for the music, for everything we'd built together. Sophia must have seen the conflict in my eyes because she reached for my hand, her grip tight and reassuring. "I don't know what to do," she admitted, her voice trembling. "This is everything I've ever wanted, but I don't want to lose you." Her words were like a balm to my soul, but they didn't make the decision any easier. I didn't know what to say, how to tell her that I didn't want to hold her back, but that the thought of being without her was unbearable. In the end, I just squeezed her hand and said the only thing I could. "We'll figure it out." But even as the words left my mouth, I couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change. The days after Sophia's offer were a blur of uncertainty and quiet tension. We didn't talk much about it, not at first. Instead, we threw ourselves into our music, into the rhythm of rehearsals and late-night writing sessions, as if we could outrun the decision that loomed over us. But it was always there, hovering in the background like a storm cloud, waiting to break. I could see the conflict in her eyes, the way she'd pause mid-sentence, lost in thought, or the way she'd tighten her grip on my hand when we sat together, as if she was afraid I'd slip away. I didn't push her. I knew this wasn't a decision she could make lightly, and the last thing I wanted was to make it harder for her. But every day that passed felt like a countdown, a reminder that our time together might be running out. Then, one evening, she showed up at my apartment unannounced. I opened the door to find her standing there, her hair windswept and her cheeks flushed from the cold. She didn't say anything at first, just stepped inside and closed the door behind her. For a moment, we stood there in silence, the weight of everything unsaid hanging heavy between us. Finally, she took a deep breath and looked at me, her eyes steady and resolute. "I'm not going," she said, her voice firm but soft. "I'm turning down the tour." I stared at her, my heart pounding in my chest, unsure if I'd heard her correctly. "Sophia," I started, but she cut me off, stepping closer and taking my hands in hers. "I've spent my whole life chasing success," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "Chasing validation, chasing this idea of what I thought I was supposed to be. But I don't want that anymore. What I want is you. What we have, it's real. It's messy and complicated, and sometimes it's really, really hard. But it's worth it. You're worth it." Her words hit me like a tidal wave, knocking the air out of my lungs and leaving me speechless. I wanted to tell her how much she meant to me, how much it meant that she was choosing us. But all I could do was pull her into my arms and hold her tight, like I was afraid she'd disappear if I let go. After that, things changed. We made a decision to build a life and career together on our own terms. It wasn't easy. There were still challenges, still moments of doubt and frustration, but we faced them together. We poured everything we had into our music, into each other, and slowly but surely, we started to find our rhythm. The songs we wrote were raw and honest, a reflection of the journey we'd been on and the love we'd found along the way. They resonated with people in a way that neither of us could have achieved alone, and it wasn't long before we started gaining recognition. Not as rivals, but as partners. It felt like a new beginning, like we were finally stepping into the life we were meant to live. The city that had once felt so cold and unforgiving started to feel different too. It was still the same place, the same crowded streets, the same flickering neon signs, the same hum of life that never seemed to stop. But it felt warmer, softer, like it had opened its arms to us. Maybe it was because we were seeing it through new eyes, or maybe it was because we were seeing it together. Either way, it felt like home. And as I stood on the rooftop of our apartment building one evening, watching the sun set over the skyline, I couldn't help but reflect on how far we'd come. We'd started as rivals, two people chasing the same dream but going about it in completely different ways. We'd clashed, competed, and hurt each other in ways that had left scars. But somewhere along the way, we'd found something deeper, a connection that went beyond the music, beyond the rivalry, beyond everything we'd thought we wanted. We'd found each other. And in doing so, we'd found ourselves. Sophia joined me on the rooftop, her presence a quiet comfort as she leaned against the railing beside me. We didn't speak. Not at first. We didn't need to. The silence between us was full of everything we'd been through, everything we'd overcome, and everything we still had to look forward to. Finally, she reached for my hand, her fingers intertwining with mine, and I felt a surge of gratitude for the woman beside me, for her strength, her vulnerability, and her willingness to take a chance on us. "We've come a long way," she said softly, her gaze fixed on the horizon. I nodded, squeezing her hand. "Yeah," I agreed, "and we're just getting started." She turned to look at me, her eyes shining with a mixture of love and determination, and in that moment, I knew we were going to be okay. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever obstacles we'd face them together, because that's what we did. That's who we were. As the sun dipped below the skyline, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. The city stretched out before us, alive with possibility, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Not just on that rooftop, but in this life, with her by my side. It wasn't perfect, and it never would be, but it was ours, and that was enough.